Come back, we're going to take questions from the audience. All right, so we're going to go to questions from the audience now, and if you raise your hand, what I'll do is take a cluster of questions and then start presenting them to the panel. And I just want to remind you, if you'll get a microphone, please stand up and hold it about 2 fists away from your mouth so that the radio can pick you up. And please keep it as terse as possible right against the wall there. And blue shirt here. And eyeglasses and green. All right. So you get 30 seconds to ask your question. It makes me nervous that you've got something written down on a piece of paper.
Under 30 seconds, I promise.
All right, go ahead.
Zeba, in your opening remarks, you said that Islamic terrorists are motivated by politics, not religion. Considering that Islamic terrorists make up the majority of suicide terrorists in the world today, what's happening to Muslims politically that isn't happening to any other major religious group that can account for the disproportionate amount of terrorism coming out of the Islamic world?
Bingo. That was a good question.
Yeah, that's
That is
under 30 seconds.
Yeah, that was a great question.
Your number. I'm going to take the questions.
Oh, sorry.
Then number 2. Yeah. Yes, I'm ready for you, sir. Oh, I'm sorry. There, with the microphone. Yes, you, sir.
The question was relatively similar, but I'll make it. This has to do with the Muslim community's reaction to suicide bombings. You stated there's 1.5 billion Muslims, and yet the silence of this community on suicide bombings, the justification, the rationalization, the wiggles from the community, from the religious community, from the Muslim states, Arab states and Muslim states, is something that in the West we find puzzling. How would the panelists react to that?
Thank you. And third question?
I hope this isn't too naive, but if Islam is not a religion of peace, is it possible for it to become one?
Wow, I think that's a great question, actually. I was trying to get at that with the reform issue, but I just think you put it far more eloquently. So I'm going to take all those questions because I thought they were all good. Zeba, do you want to take the response to the first one? Basically, why the preponderance of terrorism, the questioner is saying, is committed by Muslim extremists. Why are we not seeing that happening from other groups?
So what I can't say is, I know that it's a complicated question, and so you have history involved, you have different factors that contribute to the answer. What I can say for sure, just based on looking at the studies that come out, is that the level of religiosity, the level of piety of violence, of terrorists, compared to mainstream Muslims, is virtually, there's no difference. So it's literally, when you ask them how practicing they are, how often do they attend services, things like that, it's literally the same. So that can't be the distinguishing factor. But what we do know, as I mentioned earlier, is when you ask them, the one big difference is when you ask them what they fear the most. And they say their perceived idea of Western domination, which is very similar to what we hear from our opposition, a perceived fear of Islamic domination. And so when you compare that to the mainstream, who just want to get a job.
Would the other side like to respond to that question as well? Or to the answer that you heard? And if not, we'll move on.
Well, I'll move on.
Okay.
Can I just add something?
Sure. No,
sorry. There's also, I think, just to add something, that the preponderance has a lot to do with the spread of a certain ideology that I refer to as Islamism that has arisen in the post-colonial context and that was exported to the Middle East through geopolitics. Now, what happened was that there was a need for a cause to resist against colonialism. And Britain was a secular liberal country. The cause, the ideology that the Arabs adopted, who were resisting, initially it was Arab socialism, Baathism, and that morphed into Islamism, which owes much of its origins to Arab socialism. And so what we find is that the spread of this ideology, pretty much like how post-World War I Europe, with the identity crisis that emerged after the Weimar Republic, led to the growth of fascism in Europe, with fascism in Italy, Nazism in Germany, and totalitarian Stalinism in the USSR, we see the same thing playing out post-empire in the Middle East. So what it's related to is the spread of this ideology that has hijacked the minds of many young Muslims. And yes, Muslims need to do more to challenge this ideology. We are trying to convince them of that. But this is a very modern phenomenon. I remind you, Khomeini is a modern phenomenon, and he created a revolution where he flipped Shiite theology on its head, as are the others. Bin Laden, Sayyid Qutb, they are all modern phenomena.
Okay, Majid, you have awakened the other side on this topic.
Yes, because
Should have kept my mouth shut.
Ayaan Hirsi Ali.
Majid, what you're saying is Islamism is invented by the British. Islamism has nothing to do with Islam. External, external, external. Those poor Muslims who are seduced with the Quran and the activities of Muhammad, their own culture, their own convictions, their own history, they have, they are only the victims. Ideas inspire, ideas unite, ideas people bring together. And Muhammad succeeded first and foremost in uniting a disparate Bedouin desert Arab group of people. And they unified and they conquered. And when it worked, it was all Islam. When Muslims were successful, when they conquered lands, it was all great, it was Islam. Now that we're faced with this problem, it's Islamism, and it was created by the British Empire. I just want the other side. I don't think we will ever be able to address this issue if we systematically refuse to acknowledge, and that is what that side of the panel is doing. So let me finish it. Yeah. To systematically refuse to acknowledge the flaws of Islam. I grew up as a Muslim. I left Islam. Why did I do it? Because I couldn't hide away from the blemishes. And I believe we can improve that. I can believe we can inspire young Muslims and the youth bulge. There are millions and millions of young Muslim men under the age of 30. That in itself is a source of violence without it being Muslim. We can inspire them if we can only acknowledge that part of the problem is us, not just the British Empire.
I'm not saying it's the fault of the British. If I was going to say that, I would have joined a very successful British law firm.
What has Islamism got to do with Islam?
I'm saying to you, I would have been a lawyer and I would have got on with my life. I'm taking responsibility for that, and I'm trying to get others to take responsibility for the growth of Islamism within Muslim minds and challenge that. So no one's blaming the British and no one's claiming
the second question was on the topic of, and you almost got to it in your last answer, Majid, but the second question was, where is the clear-cut, broad condemnation of terrorism from Muslim leaders?
Yeah, so there have been many such fatwas or pronouncements against suicide bombings. In many cases they're not reported. There does need to be more. However, I'll give you an example of why in some cases there aren't more. Now, recently we at Quilliam publicized a fatwa by Dr. Tahir al-Qadri against terrorism, a no ifs, no buts condemnation of suicide bombing and terrorism that Douglas, always a pleasure to speak with you on the panel, supported. And was quoted in the press as supporting Dr. Tahir al-Qadri's fatwa against terrorism. Now, the reason why there aren't many more such examples, though there are quite a few, is because prior to Dr. Tahir al-Qadri issuing this fatwa, his colleague, who was also from the same way of thinking, was assassinated in Pakistan, was killed by a suicide bomber in a mosque where all the other congregants who were praying were also blown to smithereens because he had the guts to simply give a sermon in that mosque condemning suicide bombings. And so this is why many people are scared, because it takes guts, I tell you, to go into Pakistan and try and challenge these extremists. That's a country that doesn't have much rule of law. It's a country that's struggling against the so-called Pakistani Taliban from taking over a third of their country. And they're fighting that fight on the front lines. And there are those who are brave enough just to give a speech to condemn terrorism, and they're blown to smithereens in their mosque while praying. And surely they're religious people. They were praying in a mosque, Douglas. You did support that fatwa, though, didn't you?
I did. It's the only time I've ever done a book review of a fatwa. I'm sorry to say this, Sir Majid, you seem to have just proved our point.
Yes.
Please explain.
Is it? I mean, I'm very grateful. It's a very important and very interesting question, why more people don't stand up. I much admire al-Qadri for that fatwa, as I have other people who have stood up. But the number of times I've spoken to folks behind closed doors and so on, and you say, why aren't you saying anything? They say, because if I do speak up, I'll be killed. Well, I address you again, ladies and gentlemen, to the motion.
No, but hold on. I'm sorry. Right, hang on. How on earth does fear of being killed in Pakistan by a minority faction of extremists prove Islam is not a religion of peace?
Let me put it this way.
No, sorry, I've got to... Because really, what you've just said is really quite absurd, and I've got to clarify. It takes one person to kill all of us here. One person in a suicide bombing. Now, if we were scared of saying what we're saying now because of that one person, it doesn't mean all of us love war and hate peace in any way whatsoever. It means we all fear that one person who could walk through that door with a suicide bomb jacket strapped to his chest.
If we were
That's an
discussing
absurd argument,
Quakerism
Douglas.
here tonight, does anyone think that when a Quaker said, I'm quite fearful about speaking up against certain things in my faith, come on, this only happens with Islam. There is no other major faith in the world today where it is the case that people are fearful of addressing religion because they're afraid they'll be killed. It's only Islam, and we're saying there's a reason.
I'm afraid of being killed by apostates,
Yes,
and many of you who came here tonight came under unusual circumstances. I'm not in government. I'm not a powerful person. I'm a citizen. Just a normal, ordinary person.
Can you explain what you mean by unusual circumstances?
Unusual circumstances. You went through metal detectors to come to a debate in New York. I mean, talk about Quakerism.
That's because it takes one person to get through those metal detectors and blow us up. It doesn't mean the majority of people are terrorists.
Let me finish. The people that I am protected against, and you as an audience too, the individual who wants to kill me because I'm an apostate of Islam is inspired to do that from the scripture of Islam, the example of the Prophet Muhammad, the clergy that preached to him, and the reward he will get in the hereafter that is promised in the Quran. All of that is Islamic. The sooner you admit that,
I'll tell you what he's inspired
the sooner you admit that, the sooner I can get rid of my bodyguards.
He's inspired. I'll tell you what he's inspired by. Yeah? Right.
Michael, I want to have the last word on this point because I want to go back to the young lady's question.
Sure. So I tell you, he's inspired by the very same interpretation of Islam that you have. He's not inspired by Islam. He's inspired by your interpretation of it, that is Bin Laden's interpretation of it, that is Sayyid Qutb's interpretation of it. And I've got to say one last thing. I've got to say one last thing. The thing is, you're not the only one on this panel. I have an Al-Qaeda death threat on my head too because I'm saying what I'm saying. And what I'm saying is that, and I've been attacked in Pakistan physically for saying this, what I'm saying is enough to extremism, enough to terrorism, let's separate Islam from extremism and disempower the minority of extremists who are trying to hijack a good faith.
Douglas, you've had death threats as well.
Minority.
You have also had death threats.
Sure. I mean, one of the points about this area is everyone gets death threats. I mean, it's just an unfortunate thing about this
Zeba and I are
debate.
going to leave.
I mean, as I say again, I think it speaks for itself. I hope no one threatens a chair.
Can you repeat the question that I liked so much?
Yes.
If Islam is not a religion of peace, is it possible for it to become one?
My answer is yes, on condition that, first of all, Islam is not a religion of peace, and I hope that we have demonstrated here tonight that it's not. Can it become a religion of peace? Yes, if a number of conditions are met.
But what is it for all of the people who practice it peacefully?
But let me complete the
what
conditions.
What is that faith that
and
they're
not only
practicing
practice it peacefully, but
That's the part that I'm not finding in your explanation.
Why are we having, again, over and over again, first of all, in my view, no monotheistic religion, because there's that divider between we and they, and because when that's unifying, I mean, there are so many factors within every monotheistic religion that make it inherently aggressive. It's not only Islam. But there are a number of factors that in the 21st century combine. Again, there is the history of militarism and the awareness of that. There is the victim status. There's the youth bulge. Let's not forget that. There's the revival of that theology, the revival of the example of the Prophet Muhammad, the investment in the hereafter. And you say a lot of people practice the religion in peace. What we know is that a lot of people are passive and are actually not practicing their faith, are not practicing Islamic scripture.
Who are you to say who's practicing their faith and who's not?
Let me finish.
It's not for you to decide. I'm the Muslim. You're not.
But let me finish. Let me finish. You are not practicing. You are not practicing.
Are you Sheikh?
No, but let me say, Sheikh, you are not practicing.
Let's hear what she says.
Wait a minute. I want
Please,
to finish.
let's hear what her point
You
is.
are not practicing chapter 2 of the Quran, verse 191 and 193. And slay them wherever you find them, and drive them out of places whence they drove you out, for persecution of Muslims is worse than the slaughter of the non-believers.
Chapter 2, let there be no compulsion in religion.
Yeah.
Chapter 2, to each community which has given direction as it follows, all of you compete in the performance of good deeds.
This could go on
So
for a
which
very long
point?
time.
We have so many verses.
No.
So that's not
Let me say,
a
but that
reliable
proves my
argument.
Well,
point.
let's have
That
one
proves
person
my
speak
point.
at a time, and
If
you will
you
come
read
back.
the peaceful,
Ayan, start again, because I was talking.
that proves my point. If you read from the Quran and you say it's a religion of no compulsion, and you believe that that verse is practiced by a person like you, you will concede that there are other Muslims who will read the verse that I just quoted and be inspired to engage in acts of violence. And by the way, the verse that you just read, it has a latter part that says, except the unbelievers.
Sure, I'm sure every part does, and I can look at the Old Testament.
But
and New
I
Testament
wanted to
the same
complete
thing.
the answer to the
Ayan,
question.
Let's Seba answer this.
Sorry, what was the last point?
Well, my last point was that it is both. It's not just a religion of peace; it's also a religion of war, and both verses prove
Okay,
that.
but do you want to respond to that, Seba, or do you want to?
I think I'll have to come back.
Okay, Douglas.
That is an important one. Ayan and I, and people who make some of the points we make, are often accused of taking bits of the Quran out of context. I think you've just seen a very good example of it from the other side. I'm not saying that that isn't a good verse to live one's life by. One cannot just simply quote the verse about there being no compulsion in religion as
And
though
you
it
can't
doesn't
quote
have
the other ones either
a
without
follow-on.
context.
It has
As
a
though
follow-on.
it doesn't
So
have
do
a
those
follow-on. And
ones.
as Ayan has just showed you,
As
it
does
has
those
a
ones.
follow-on. So I think this gets back to the very important question the lady halfway back there made, which is whether or not this can be a religion of peace. I believe it can be. And when I said earlier there are three types of Islam I identified, I said the first one, the scriptures, the life of Muhammad and so on, bad. Second one, Sharia, interpretations, bad. But thirdly, the way Muslims live their lives today, in this country and countries like it, that is our source for hope. And the source of hope for that is that they individually use, like many people do religion. I'm not a religious person, Ayan isn't either. But we recognise the fact that people of religious faith have the right to that faith, should practice that faith, should have no fear of practicing that faith. There's no problem with this. But it's a private matter, and one which people come to very strange private arrangements about. And I just wanted to add this, which is that if those people are going to be able to reform that faith into the religion of peace you're talking about, then yes, we would be the first people to encourage them. But if we're going to have that debate, as I hope we've shown tonight, it has to start with honesty.
Let's do one more round of questions.
It has to start with frankness.
Donna, do we have time for one more round? Yeah. So I'm going to do it again. I would love to hear from an audience member who is a member of the Muslim community.
Yeah.
If you feel like speaking. And not that I'm profiling, but I saw a lot of blonde people raising their hands. And again, I realize it's a complex world.
Jihad Jane was
That
blonde.
kind of profiling is allowed.
All right, I'm going to take something from the left. Yes, blonde person, you can go. Anybody from the... Yeah, okay, go ahead. And then on the right side, yes, okay. Ma'am, I see you. Yep. So, again, remember that way that great question was phrased? That's how you do it.
So, for those in favor of the motion, my question is, what she just read from the Quran. You know, you expressed that you didn't agree with it, and clearly, you know, you're interpreting the religion as you will and in a very peaceful way, which is great. But you know, do you ignore those parts? How do you react to it? You said there were multiple ways, just like we interpret the Constitution, there are multiple ways to interpret what the Quran is saying. I just want to know exactly how you interpret that chapter she just read to us.
Thank you. To that end, I happen to be Roman Catholic, but my wife is Israeli, and my son just went through his bar mitzvah. There was some pretty spicy stuff in Leviticus.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
But then
I had no
Catholicism went through the Reformation and Enlightenment.
Yes.
Hello, I'm from Pakistan. I'm a Muslim from Pakistan, and I just want to comment on the suicide bombings. There's one almost every week. And if you feel that as a nation, after being destroyed repeatedly since 9/11, we would still be sympathetic to extremist sentiments when two of my students were killed in suicide bombings.
But what is your question?
My question is, I want you to consider what the value of socio-economic, cultural factors, political dictatorships. What role do those factors play in making young people susceptible to extremism?
Do you not feel that Majid covered that in his remarks? Because I feel that he did.
Well, I don't think the audience understands.
Let me put it on hold then, and then the third person.
I have a question for Ayan Hirsi Ali. I'm a Muslim woman, and she was referring to the subjugation of women. This has to do with the subjugation of women. I'm from India, and my question is, if women are not educated, in a lot of Muslim countries, that's the problem, that the education, women are not educated. And when they're not educated, they don't know what their rights are. And so they're not going to demand their rights. That's the whole point in not educating half the population. But my question to you is, what does that have to do with Islam? Because according to my understanding of the Quran, the first word that was revealed of the Quran to Prophet Muhammad was read. It had to do with education. And the Quran...
So can you give me a question in one sentence? I know you can, so go for it.
My question is, what does that have to do with Islam? Because the Quran doesn't say that, according to my understanding. The education, it doesn't say educate men, do not educate women. Nowhere in the Quran have I found that.
Let's take that last question first.
I want to agree. Thank you so much for that question. I completely agree with you that women in the Muslim world today, not all of them, but most of them, are denied education. The reasons that are given by those who do the denying are Islamic. They refer to the concept of guardianship. So the guardian has the authority to decide whether he sends a girl to school or not, and for how long she goes to school. The main reason in Muslim countries where girls are sent to school, Muslim communities where girls are sent to school, the main reason for pulling them out at the age of menstruation is the fear, the terror that they might lose their virginity. That modesty, sexual modesty that is demanded of girls, which at first it preceded Islam, it was a tribal Arab culture elevated to religion in Islam, where people find within the Quran that in the Hadith, that insistency on her virginity, on her being a virgin on the night of her wedding, that is one of the main reasons that is given. And if sexual emancipation were to occur within the Muslim world, and I want to challenge a guy like Maajid Nawaz to take the forefront as a man by saying that you value a partner, a human being, more than her hymen, that would revolutionize Islam completely. It would take, girls would go to school, they would be independent, they would be able to articulate what their rights are, and more importantly, they could make Islam a religion of peace because they would bring their boys up to be employable, to be educated, and to renounce suicide, killings, and martyrdom. Uneducated mothers are mothers whose children, whose boys, bad guys can take advantage of.
We're at the point where normally we move on to our third round. We have these two questions standing out there, and I'm going to extend, with everybody's acceptance, a few minutes of this section tonight. Nobody seems to be leaving, and no one's asleep. Maajid, if you can be very brief to that, and then I want to get to the last question.
To be honest, I value a can of Diet Coke more than a hymen. I mean, really, everything's more valuable to me than a hymen, and especially a woman. So I really don't understand the point of your question there. But allow me to say, however, that every Muslim questioner from the audience today is not a true Muslim, and every one of you may be a Christian is not really a Christian, and any of you may be a Jew is not really a Jew, because I have the absolute monopoly of defining all three of those religions for all of you. And really the passages that, because I'm saying this because of the first question, and that is the passages that were referred to about fight them wherever you see them. Now the thing is really, the founding fathers of this great country who wrote the Constitution believed in slavery and were practicing slavery. Now, does that mean that we're going to define the whole of America and its Constitution by that practice? Or are we going to contextualize that practice and say that when they founded this country, slavery and abolishing slavery was not at the forefront of their minds, but later on it was abolished, and that's an achievement for this country. It's not something that defines this country. And so, likewise, these passages, yes, they can be used and they are used in a problematic way. And it's our responsibility, not just as Muslims, but as decent human beings, to go out there and challenge the abuse of these passages. But we must not forget that as with every other document in history, It had its context, and it was abused, and now when we have gone ex post facto, we can look back to that and judge it with the very civilized standards that we've arrived at and say, that was wrong. Now, perhaps
let me
in
put
50 years' time, I may be defined as uncivilized.
I want to put the question as it was phrased to Zeba, which was, how do you filter out? Right, exactly. How do you filter that out?
How do I interpret is what you're asking. Despite what our opposition says, I do have that right. And basically, I look at my faith. I'm sorry, who asked the question? Oh, okay. I look at my faith and the way I was raised with core Islamic principles, which is how my family raised me and that I determined as an adult were correct, which is compassion and tolerance and plurality and strength and diversity, because we are a diverse population. There are as many interpretations of Islam as there are people. And so the other point I want to make to that is that there are clergy and clerics who are who do stress this. I mean, if you look at 2005, at the Iman message, where 200 Muslim scholars from 50 countries stressed a re-emphasis of Islam's core values of compassion, mutual respect, acceptance, freedom of religion. There is precedent for this, not just for me as a layperson, but from the clergy as well, to reassert these lost, in some areas, lost values.
Douglas Murray.
I do have to. This is a very, very complex one, but it has to be said. Majid's just given the comparison with the Founding Fathers, and there has to be some clarity about this. This country rightly reveres your Founding Fathers, but you don't think that their word was immutable or unchangeable. Yeah. You don't believe, I don't think that anyone in this room who criticised Mr. Jefferson now here tonight will be declared an anti-American apostate who can be fit for slaughter. The problem that our opponents have to address, this, is that in a religion which is based on the idea that the Quran was dictated direct by God to Muhammad, and that therefore if you are criticizing the Quran or throwing out bits or pulling it apart, like most Christians and Jews have come to that stage, where pretty much you pick a mix with your holy scriptures, and it's quite a good, humane way around it. But with Islam, if this is the revealed word of God, revealed, it has to be said, as it was shown again earlier tonight, in a particularly obscure and unreadable dialect, which, if it was meant to be understood by the whole of the world, it's a bad place to start. If this were the case, then, as I say, we come back to this problem. The Founding Fathers said many great things and did some bad things. But you are not committed as Americans not to criticize the bad things they did. And this is a problem our opponents are going to have to address.
And that concludes round 2 of our debate. So here's where we are. We are about to hear